If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mindshock. This is your host, Bruce McGuire.
And there.
The long-awaited Roswell Incident Podcast. Roswell, the 1947 alleged flying saucer crash, is probably the most infamous UFO crash, UFO incident, or possible even government conspiracy in general, even rivaling the popularity of the JFK assassination. And if you haven't checked out the JFK podcast on Mindshock, make sure you check that out as well. And as always, if you want to support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through, or you could just go to youtube.com/Mindshock. Like and share this podcast on social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. And as always, questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. All right, JR, before we dive into this incident, we're going to be going through all the nitty-gritty in typical Mindshock fashion, which is why everybody tunes into Mindshock, where we logically examine every possible theory without falling for logical fallacies. Is there any insider information you have about the incident that you'd like to share from the get-go?
I don't know, Bruce. I don't know if I'm at liberty to talk about Roswell.
Well, that's what I told you this podcast would be on.
Well, like you didn't get me sufficiently drunk like you promised me last podcast, Bruce. So, let me just put it out there this way. Like, Roswell, according to the government, is just, a testing center for planes. That's the official response.
Okay, so let's go through it. So just a quick overview from the wiki. So we have the official story as it stands today, because the official story initially, and we'll be going over this as well, when the incident first occurred, there was no government conspiracy or cover-up. They flat out admitted that a UFO crashed and the military was on the ground to investigate, etc., etc. The story only changed after a directive came in, 48 hours afterwards, and then all of a sudden there was no previous referencing to anything other than a crashed air balloon. So I'm going to go over the overview of Roswell as the official narrative consists of today, not necessarily at the time of the crash. So the Roswell incident is the 1947 crash of a flying saucer at a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. On July 8th, 1947, Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release stating that they recovered a, quote, flying disc, end quote, from a ranch near Roswell. The Army quickly retracted the statement and claimed instead that the crashed object was a conventional weather balloon. Now, before I continue there, is that typical of government agencies where if they not necessarily let something slip, but if there was no gag order on UFOs, so to speak, there was nothing preventing them, there was no protocol in place in 1947, or if there was, I'm not aware of one. So they were able to freely make these statements, and then once the directive or protocols changed, they quickly retracted. Like, how does this normally occur in the scope of government agencies, JR?
Well, normally it's some sort of agency like the Hearst organization, Hearst Media, that shows up, just randomly and starts taking photographs. And normally, like, the generals or, whoever is, like, running the operation at the time is normally required to throw some breadcrumbs to the public until the upper command has, some sort of, like, permanent statement to make. The unfortunate part is normally those generals end up tripping on a broomstick or falling out a window after they make those statements to the press. So, that's just standard procedure. But, it also varies on the public's interest. You have to look at it twofold. Roswell, Area 51 and that whole thing, which, by the way, nobody ever asks about areas 1 through, 50, and no one asks about 52 through, 60
I
something else.
believe I believe
So,
we touched upon this topic, and for those that haven't listened to the Kenny Beach podcast, I actually go over Area 52 in the Kenny Beach podcast.
yeah, no, I know that. But, at the same time, it's twofold for the government. First of all, it, creates government interest, which, a lot of people think that, the government doesn't want to, have that type of relationship with the public, but they really do, in certain regards. First of all, it keeps people's eyes on a certain area of the United States while they're up in, Maine or, Alaska, running the HARP project. You don't see many, people taking photographs up there. So, it kind of keeps, the people at bay by having, one particular zone that they're focused on. It also kind of illustrates the power of the government to the people in general. Seeing big, signs saying that you'll be shot, and then seeing random people just sitting on hoods of cars in hills gives the illusion that the government may actually be more powerful than it really is to the American people. So okay. It's also twofold.
Okay, so give me your opinion on two things. One, average American Joe Schmo in 1947, they see this release, RAAF captures flying saucer, and then a day or two later, all of a sudden, it's just a weather balloon. So does average Joe Schmo in the time period of 1947 simply take on blind faith that there was some kind of error in the initial report and then it really was a hot air balloon the whole time? Or are there critical thinking individuals out there that are thinking, oh, wow, maybe the military, they wanted to get out ahead of this thing. They didn't realize what kind of an impact it would have to report honestly that it really was a flying saucer. Now there's this whole cover up. What are you thinking?
Well, okay. There probably were some, people that were thinking it was a cover-up from the outset. However, you also have to look at the time period in which it exists. You're talking about just after W2. The entire United States had a rah and a positive outlook of the United States military. It wasn't criticized like it was in Vietnam. And in addition to that, it didn't just extend to troops or soldiers. It extended to even the common housewife that was a part of the war effort itself. So the perspective of the military in general and how it was perceived in the United States was vastly different than that of today. So it's difficult to actually put 100% finger on that. A lot of the stuff that the military said at the time of World War II, whether or not you believe that the Nazis didn't have bases in Antarctica or anything like that, the government, a lot of people took it at face value. So I would say the general majority of people probably thought it was an error in reporting.
Okay, and this is something that's, I don't believe, it's talked about extensively, but this is Mindshock. So now, while you're on the topic, I might as well ask you this. Do you believe that the end of World War II, so less than 2 years prior to the Roswell incident, do you believe it's coincidental that the Roswell incident is coming on the tail of World War II, or not?
Okay. It's possible that it's coincidental. More likely than not, the way because there was so much technology that was developed for World War II, it was a very easy, very plausible cover story. You got to remember, again, housewives went to munition factories and airplane fields to build stuff for the war effort. So even the common folk were seeing the technology for the first time that our government was capable of. So the people were a lot more educated as to what the government was actually doing, as opposed to, say, World War I or just, any other war previous to that. The government's technology was a lot more shrouded. It wasn't so out in the open.
Okay, is this your way of saying that the German flying saucer technology, I'm sure you're aware of it. I mean, there's even videos of it, of them testing flying saucers. Do you believe it's connected to the Germans, or do you believe it was the Russians using the confiscated German technology? And I'm not going to go into all the different Roswell theories right now. We're still in the overview. I'm going to go into them in a little bit. But we might as well get into it. Do you believe that it has something to do with technology derived from World War II, and instead of there being beings from other worlds, whether we're talking planets, whether we're talking interdimensional, and that's something that's not discussed as much in relation to Roswell, could these have been interdimensional visitors as opposed to visitors from another planet? I know I'm loading you up with questions, but if you could keep them straight. Or do you believe it's World War II human technology, either German or Russian?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Bruce. First of all, the fact that like there's like interdimensional beings, I think that like is possible in any time frame, especially since like interdimensions, like you can cross between time. So I think that's always a possibility for everything, including like, you know, where did I like put my keys, or like, you know, where's the vacuum cleaner? Like I think that like it's possible for.
Whoa. Are you saying that people who misplace objects like keys and they look in the exact spot where it turns out to be later? I mean, that's happened to you, right? Where you dropped your key,
Yeah.
you know exactly where you look there, but it's not there. You go look into a bunch of other places and you go back to look in the original spot where you truly remembered leaving them, and they're actually there at that time. Are you saying these are some kind of interdimensional rifts?
Well, it's a possibility, Bruce. I mean, like, can you claim that, like, you know, it's not otherwise? I mean, you know.
I can't claim anything, JR. This is Mindshock, where the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. But, okay. So, can you address the part about the German-Russian technology?
I can sort of. I mean, I can't definitively say anything, but what I can say is that if you look at like the ancient Egyptians having batteries, which is well documented, they existed X thousands of years ago. If you look at like the exponential rate of technology based on the fact that like in the past 100 years, like this technology has been like, we've gone from like candlestick phones to you know, the internet. I mean, and keep in mind like this was slowly released technology from like the government, but based on the acceleration of technology, that didn't just come out of the blue. Like based on if ancient Egyptians had batteries, it would be common sense that this technology would be freely available based on the population, because that's the other thing that people fail to understand. It's like, oh wow, you know, that the population didn't have anything to do with like massive acceleration in technology or technological growth. I mean, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, they had batteries, and there were like supposedly X hundred.
Let me rein you in here specifically to technology developed by modern Germany or modern Russia. Because you're probably familiar with Annie Jacobson. She talked about Operation Paperclip in her book. I believe she alleges that the Roswell incident is Russian technology where they used some kind of mutated humans to make them appear to be aliens in order to trick the U.S. in some capacity or to observe their response as such. I'm sure you're familiar with that theory.
Yeah, I am, and like, you know, like I can't really like put that past any particular nation, and like the Russians are like just like pretty matter of fact, so that wouldn't surprise me if they did that at all, in fact. And I wouldn't put it past Germany. I wouldn't put it past, I mean, I wouldn't put it past America. And let's face it, like the founding fathers, most of them were from Europe anyway. So, I mean, like, it's really not that difficult to believe. I mean, technically, the foundations of America were built over, you know, across the pond. It wasn't just the British. So, yeah.
Right, hold on a second. Are you saying, is that your way of leaking information saying that the U.S. might have perpetrated an operation specifically to blame the Russians into mutating humans or using mutated midgets to make them appear to be aliens in order to trick the populace? Is that what you're saying?
Well, Bruce, I can't really say anything specific, but what I can say is, if you look at it this way, Project Blue, Project, you know, all of these, like, you know, were like mind control, Manchurian candidates, all of these various things were happening around the same era. Now, if you have one lie and you kind of keep it secret, then how many other lies are going on behind the scenes that you were able to, like, you know, keep at bay? If they were, like, giving people LSD and trying to program them to be, you know, sharpshooters or, you know, Manchurian candidates, what makes you not believe that they're willing to, you know, perpetrate frauds and create propaganda against other nations? I mean, North Korea does it all the time.
Very, very fair points. All right, let's get back to the overview here. So the Army quickly retracted the statement, claimed that the crashed object was a conventional weather balloon. The Roswell incident did not surface again until the late 70s when a retired lieutenant colonel, in an interview with a researcher of unidentified flying objects, alleged that the weather balloon account had been a cover story. First and second-hand witnesses of crash locations and witnesses involved claimed that one or more alien spacecraft had crash landed and that the extraterrestrial occupants had been recovered by the military, which then engaged in a cover-up. In 1994, the U.S. Air Force published a report claiming again that the crashed object was a nuclear test surveillance balloon from Project Mogul. Another Air Force report published in 1997 claimed that stories of alien bodies probably stemmed from test dummies being dropped from high altitude. Research about the event nevertheless persists, and the Roswell incident continues to be of interest in the public and in popular media. Now, is that just convenient cover-up stories? Because again, I'm a little bit fuzzy on my timelines, but didn't they not use test dummies until a number of years after 47?
Yeah, well, I mean, see, here's the thing, Bruce. It really doesn't matter. Like, it's just a matter of, like, which they did it. Like, if there was nothing more than just a nuclear test with them throwing, like, stuff out of an aircraft, whether it's dummies or anything else, why would they continue to publish reports and pay people to, like, write those reports? It's almost like the serial killer that just keeps washing his hands at the sink over and over again to get rid of the blood. I mean, seriously, like, if there was nothing, then, like, why would you do that? Like, so there's obviously something more to the story in terms of, like, whether they're dummies or, like, what era or, like, the exact time frame. Like, those are just things that people are trying to use to paint them into a corner because it's so fucking obvious that there's something else going on that they don't, like, you know, they're trying to peg down these certain points, and they're never going to be able to do that because the government is, like, really good. I mean, talk about, like, I mean, if the mafia can produce the Teflon Don, what can the federal government that has trillions of dollars at disposal, like, what can they produce? Like, so it's not really difficult. The fact that they keep coming out with these reports, which now they're just like, oh yeah, there's UFOs. Like, now, like, the fact that they're just coming out with, like, report after report obviously says something. Now, it could also be that they were worried back in back in 97, because there was some sort of other alien terrestrial event that was taking place at the time, and they simply wanted to just put that at bay to keep people interested in Roswell while there was something going on, you know, else going on in the world. But, I mean, the best bet to do that is do research on paranormal or, like, interdimensional activities through 1997 and see, like, what comes up. Because I bet you the U.S. is somehow involved in it, like, at the time. You know, some random, you know, U-boat or PT boat disappears or something along those lines. U-boat, where the fuck did I get that? PT boat, you know, just disappears out of the blue. You know, that kind of thing. So, you know, it's probably something along those lines. But why do they keep generating reports in general? Like, why would you pay someone to write a report when it's already been published?
You know, you said you weren't going to reveal a lot, but that's quite a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, you didn't get me sufficiently drunk, but, like, I do have this bottle of cognac. Anyway, Bruce, let's get back to the podcast. What,
All right. Well, the official narrative is saying that there was quite a lull of activity until the 70s. I'm not sure if that's true. I think there were researchers working the entire time because the initial witnesses, they were quite vocal. I know there
but
were...
look at it this way. The 70s was the advent of the internet. So people were starting to be like, hey, I've got this stack of papers, and this university's like, oh, well, I did these patents for the government. And then some guy that probably owns, like, a successful hot dog company somewhere was just like, gee, you know, like, these guys were making these patents in the 60s and 50s. These people were making patents in the 60s and 50s. If you put these two patents together, then gee, like the government has this technology. Or wow, like this happened in space. We didn't used to share information so freely with each other. It wasn't just country to country. It's also person to person. Remember the phone book, Bruce?
I have vague recollections, so let's...
Yeah.
So, continuing the write-up here, the events of July 47, the Roswell incident occurred amid the flying saucer craze of 1947. On June 26th, media nationwide had reported civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold's story of seeing what he labeled flying saucers. Historians would later chronicle over 800 copycat sightings that were reported after the Arnold story was published. The debris discovered, the sequence of events was triggered in late June or early July 47 when William Mac Brazel, a ranch foreman, noticed clusters of debris on the Foster Ranch, which was about 30 miles outside of Roswell. Initial press coverage suggested Brazel first noticed the material in early July, though later reports suggest a June date for the discovery of debris. Discovery reported to authorities July 6th. On or around July 6th, Brazel reported the discovery to Sheriff George Wilcox in Roswell. Wilcox, in turn, called RAAF intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel, who assembled a detail to visit the Foster Ranch. Around 4 p.m. that afternoon, Brazel left Roswell, followed by Marcel, Lieutenant Colonel Sheridan Cavett, and Master Sergeant Bill Rickett. The following morning, presumably July 7th, the Army Air Force detail inspected the debris on the Foster Ranch and transported some or all of it back to Roswell. Public announcement of a recovered flying disc, July 8th. July 8th, 1947, RAAF Public Information Officer Walter Haut issued a press release stating that personnel from the field's 509th Operations Group had recovered a flying disc which had landed on a ranch near Roswell. The report was immediately picked up by numerous news outlets. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chavez County.
I wonder what the cooperation looked like.
Well, I was just about to mention that, Chaves County, as if they could stop them.
And the other interesting thing is, I'd like to know how long those people lived after this news report, and like they probably all died of asbestosis. You know what I mean? So yeah, like.
Well, apparently some of them survived, but then I do vaguely recall some kind of obscure reporting and documentaries where people in the area, particularly there was a well involved, and they had some kind of mutations as a result of water from the well. Do you recall any of that? I don't remember which documentary it was.
No, Bruce, I mean, like, I watch Civil Action like everybody else, but, like, at the end of the day, like, I don't really know, like, how, that worked. I mean, it could be that, like, certain people entered the well and, like, unfortunately, like, they never came out of the well and that, like, polluted the water supply. It could be a bunch of different reasons. I mean, you don't really, it's a desert, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of open space.
Action was immediately taken, and the disc was picked up at the rancher's home. It was inspected at the Roswell Army Airfield and subsequently loaned by Major Marcel to the higher headquarters. Did he have the authority to not do? Well, wait, what? So it was loaned to higher headquarters. Does that sound? Is that typical jargon? Higher headquarters?
Yeah, like the fabric that you're entering into, Bruce, like, I'm not going to get into, like, how people, label certain things and talk about certain things. Basically, the guy that wrote that was probably some schmuck, poor schmuck with a gun that was just looking to feed his family. And, he had to strap it to, like, a deuce and a half and drive it to some, high security clearance place where they told him to get the fuck out of the deuce and a half when he got there. And then, like, he went to the commissary, had, like, some SOS, and then was on his way.
All right, so continuing on here, researcher Kendrick Frazier notes, The idea of alien spacecraft hadn't gained hold yet. At best, the concern was that if they were physical craft at all, they might be Soviet or even holdover Nazi aircraft. And do you know anything about that?
Well, again, it wouldn't like really surprise me all that much. I mean, it's common practice. It is common practice for any government that is involved in any war. You're obviously going to the spoils of war. You're going to take them apart and see what your enemy is working with. I mean, during World War II, we had to play catch up. We weren't necessarily, a lot of people think that like we just went into it all guns blazing. In reality, we had to build like hundreds of ships like overnight. Like we weren't necessarily that prepared for World War II, as like a lot of people just assume we are today. We talk about like the military budget and all this stuff. FDR is like responsible for enacting a lot of that crap. Like it didn't really exist during World War One, and I mean we were fucking stone broke during the Revolutionary War. So, and like even the Civil War, the only reason why the Union won and the South lost was because the Union had a more established infrastructure and trade routes, and like they just kind of like knew where those trade routes were.
Let me rein you in there, but you did make a fair point actually. Even for World War II, I believe there wasn't enough budget. Weren't they raising money from celebrities and such for fundraisers?
Yeah, I mean like basically, I mean I know like Boeing and like a whole bunch of these other places, they basically were like forced into these government contracts because they were the only places that had the infrastructure to build such massive, like the guy that built the Hoover Dam, I forget his name, it's off the top of my head, but he built the Hoover Dam and like he was just like this like master like engineer guy, even though I don't even think he was technically a licensed engineer. He's the one that created these incredible shipyards to build like this massive amount of ships and such. Like basically overnight. Like they were like at some point they were launching like 10 a day. Like they got to the point where they were launching so many ships they didn't even christen each ship. Like they didn't give each one, like they just assigned it a name and just threw it in the water. So like I said, like we weren't as prepared. I mean our grandparents, depending on like your age, our grandparents or your parents, their generation, they understand that because they were a part of that, which again harkens back to why in the beginning people just took this at face value. It wasn't until the 70s when the kids of that generation were really active and started to ascend into leadership roles, especially within the military, that they started to say, well, wait a minute, what is that? It didn't happen.
All right, let's continue here. Weather balloon versus nuclear test monitoring balloon. July 9th. Colonel William H. Blanchard, commanding officer of the 509th, contacted General Roger M. Ramey of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, and Ramey ordered the object be flown to Fort Worth Army Airfield. At the base, Warrant Officer Irving Newton confirmed Ramey's preliminary opinion, identifying the object as being a weather balloon and its kite, a nickname for a radar reflector used to track the balloons from the ground. A telex sent to a Federal Bureau of Investigation office from the Fort Worth, Texas office quoted a major from the 8th Air Force, also based in Fort Worth at Carswell Air Force Base, on July 8, 1947, as saying that, quote, the disc is hexagonal in shape and was suspended from a balloon by cable, which balloon was approximately 20 feet in diameter. Major Curtin further advises that the object found resembles a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector, but that telephonic conversation between their office and the right field had not, unintelligible, borne out this belief, end quote. Now, I'm going to say this right now, JR, and I don't know why nobody's talking about this. If this was merely a crashed air balloon of some sort, how come it's the only one that was ever reported? I mean, let's look at I mean, obviously there are weather balloons that have come down. There was never any crazy stories about alien bodies or misinterpreting bodies, test dummies. It's never happened. So, in the scope of decades and decades, if it was simply just a hot air balloon and some kind of radar reflector, how come none of these other air balloons or radar reflectors are being mistaken for UFOs and alien bodies and all of this stuff?
Well, I don't really have a direct answer for that. What I can say is that one of my relatives, who's much older than me, who was in World War II, and he's directly related to me, was heavily involved. I'm not going to disclose who it is, but he was directly related to me. Was involved in a project called Blackbird, which is where we learned that planes were different than birds. Okay, you can look it up. It's a declassified project. And I can tell you that if you did your homework, you would find that that technology actually existed long before it was made public, that we knew that. Okay, so that said, and the incidents that subsequently occurred to where we, had to learn this technology, quote unquote, in order to defend ourselves, that could also be regarded as kind of a cover-up, because we did have that technology. So the fact that they're using these particular examples as weather balloons, like I said, it goes back to why do they keep washing their hands of this? So I think that it's safe to say that the weather balloon thing is kind of bunko. To what end, I think that's the magic question. I think most people with any type of logic or reason would see that the weather balloon theory really doesn't make that much sense.
Yeah. All right. So what was that?
No, I mean, it's possible that, at one point in time, at some point in history, someone did see a weather balloon in the sky. There's probably a lot of airmen that saw a weather balloon in the sky. Makes a really good cover story. But no, I don't believe it was a weather balloon.
Well, it just doesn't, like you said, it doesn't hold up to logic and reason when you factor in all of these other hot air balloons, and nothing was ever on this scale anywhere else. So it just doesn't really hold a lot of water. But continuing on here, on July 9th, the press reported that General Ramey had stated that a weather balloon was recovered by the RAAF personnel. A press conference was held featuring debris, foil, rubber, and wood, said to be from the crashed object, which matched the weather balloon description. Historian Robert Goldberg wrote that the intended effect was achieved. Quote, the story died the next day, end quote. As described in the July 9th, 1947 edition of the Roswell Daily Record, the balloon which held it up, if that was how it worked, must have been 12 feet long. Brazel felt, measuring the distance by the size of the room in which he sat. The rubber was smoky gray in color and scattered over an area about 200 yards in diameter. When the debris was gathered up, the tinfoil, paper, tape, and sticks made a bundle about 3 feet long and 7 or 8 inches thick, while the rubber made a bundle about 18 or 20 inches long and about 8 inches thick. In all, he estimated the entire lot would have weighed maybe 5 pounds, 2 kilograms. There was no sign of any metal in the area which might have been used for an engine, and no sign of any propellers of any kind, although at least one paper fin had been glued onto some sort of the tinfoil. There were no words to be found anywhere on the instrument, although there were letters on some of the parts. Considerable Scotch tape and some tape with flowers printed upon it had been used in the construction. No strings or wires were found, but there were some eyelets in the paper to indicate that some sort of attachment may have been used. And this was from the Roswell Daily Record. Another point here, I haven't heard anybody discuss this, and this is Mindshock, where we don't fall for logical fallacies, especially not false dichotomy. Who's to say there wasn't a crashed hot air balloon, but there was also a flying saucer crash, and they simply used the hot air balloon to deflect, and that's why there's funny business on the dates. Because if there was a legitimate UFO crash and the debris was evident days before in June, then the U.S. military wanted to cover it up, so they intentionally crashed a hot air balloon after the fact and deflected using that. What do you think of this theory, JR? Is this is going to be the McGuire theory regarding Roswell?
Yeah, that's very possible. The other question is if it's like these crash dummies that you keep talking about, like who was pushing them out of the vehicle at the time?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Seriously. Seriously. I mean, and if it's 3 by 5 or 5 by 5, then how could it support the weight of a crash dummy?
So, very good points. I have no idea. The story does not add up on any level. Continuing here.
Has anyone tried to ever replicate the hot air balloon or the?
I believe they only point to projects that existed over a decade later with larger sizes. I don't believe anybody tried to replicate using those dimensions. So, on July 9th, Brazel told the Roswell Daily Record that the debris consisted of, quote, large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, a rather tough paper, and sticks, end quote. He paid little attention to it, but returned later with his wife and daughter to gather up some of the debris. Some accounts have described Brazel as having gathered some of the material earlier, rolling it together and stashing it under some brush. On July 9th, Marcel explained, we spent a couple of hours Monday afternoon, July 7th, looking for any more parts of the weather device, said Marcel. We found a few more patches of tinfoil and rubber. That day, it was reported that Brazel had reported the debris after hearing reports about flying discs and wondering if that was what he had picked up, then going to see Sheriff Wilcox, where he whispered, kinda confidential like, that he may have found a flying disc. And here's another point, too. If this was some other type of technology, either Soviet in nature or extraterrestrial, who's to say they didn't crash through a weather balloon, bringing it down with it?
Yeah.
That'd be awfully convenient, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.
All right, subsequent publications and conspiracy claims. After the initial newspaper reports in 1947, the Roswell incident faded from public attention for more than 30 years when interest reemerged in the late 70s. The Roswell incident was featured in films, TV shows, and books. Amid increasingly complex conspiracy theories, multiple hoaxes and legends about alien bodies were incorporated into the Roswell mythos. The trend culminated in 1995's purported footage of alien autopsy, which filmmakers later revealed to be a hoax, though they preferred the term reconstruction. And I want to take a moment to address the alien autopsy tape. I'm sure you've seen it, JR.
Yes.
Okay, so there's one major issue I have with the coincidence theorists in writing off the alien autopsy. And again, I'm not saying it's real or fake, but there's just a fundamental lack of understanding of how this would work. And I will reveal that in a moment, but let's just do the run through on the alien autopsy. The Alien Autopsy is a 17-minute black and white film supposedly depicting a secret medical examination or autopsy of an alien by the U.S. military. It was released in 1995 by London-based entrepreneur Ray Santilli. He presented it as an authentic autopsy on the body of an alien recovered from the 1947 crash of a flying disc near Roswell, New Mexico. The film footage was allegedly supplied to him by a retired military cameraman who wished to remain anonymous. In 2006, Santilli admitted the film was not authentic, but rather a staged reconstruction of footage he claimed to have viewed in 1992, but which had deteriorated and became unusable by the time he made the film. He claimed that a few frames of the original were embedded in his film, but never specified which one. The existence of an original film strip of the alleged autopsy has never been independently verified. So, Alien Autopsy Fact or Fiction. Fox televised a broadcast including this footage hosted by Jonathan Frekes in the U.S. on August 28, 1995, under the title Alien Autopsy Fact or Fiction. The program caused a sensation with Time magazine declaring that the film sparked a debate with an intensity not lavished on any home movie since the Zapruder film. Fox rebroadcast the program twice, each time to higher ratings, with the November 1995 broadcast winning its time slot again with 11.7 million viewers and a 14% share. Although in the broadcast version, some parts of the autopsy were pixelized or edited out because of their supposed graphic nature, the earlier version contained, Santilli claimed, the complete and unedited film in addition to previously unreleased footage of the wreckage, which was presented as the remains of the alien craft reported to have crashed in Roswell. The Fox program features numerous well-known figures both in front of and behind the camera. Interviews with experts on the authenticity of the film include Oscar-winning special effects makeup artist Stan Winston, cinematographer Alan DeVoe, and noted forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht, who considered the autopsy procedures in the film to be authentic, but stopped short of declaring the being an alien. Film director John Jobson was engaged by producer Robert Kiviat to direct several portions of the Fox special, including Santilli's interview. Jobson has stated that he became immediately suspicious upon meeting Santilli in London and, after conducting further investigation, told both Fox and Kiviat that he believed the whole thing was a fraud. He described their responses. It was then made clear to me that if the footage was exposed as a hoax before the show aired, the ratings would suffer. Jobson then enlisted the services of his friend, well-known PI William Deere, but according to Jobson, Deere was held back by the producers for fear the hoax would be exposed before the air date, and he was limited to investigating the identity of the mystery cameraman. Two of the program's participants claimed their observations were distorted. Stan Winston and Kevin D. Randall, a noted UFO author and investigator, both claimed they clearly stated in their interview they believed the footage was a hoax, but their statements were not used. Also, on August 28, 1995, the UK Channel 4 screened the Roswell incident as a special edition of its long-running Secret History documentary series, which included the purported autopsy footage. Santilli's admission. In 2006, the events surrounding the release of the footage were adapted as a British feature film comedy, Alien Autopsy, directed by John Campbell and written by William Davies. Have you seen that one? I actually have not seen that one.
No, I haven't seen it.
The film presents a humorous reconstruction of the making of the Santilli film based on Santilli's statements without commenting on the veracity of his claims. On April 4th, 2006, days before the release of the film, Sky broadcast the documentary Amon Investigates, Alien Autopsy, presented by Amon Holmes. In this program, Ray Santilli and fellow producer Gary Shufield admitted that their film was actually a reconstruction containing only, in their words, a few frames from the original 22 rolls of film, each averaging 4 minutes in length, that Santilli claimed to have viewed in 1992. They explained that by the time they had raised enough money to purchase the original, only a few frames were still intact, the rest having been degraded beyond the point of usability by heat and humidity. In the documentary, Amon Holmes repeatedly refers to the film as a fake, while Santilli patiently insists it's a restoration, maintaining it's a reconstruction of an actual alien autopsy film he viewed in the early 90s that subsequently deteriorated. Santilli and Shufield stated that they had restored the damaged footage by filming a simulated autopsy on a fabricated alien based upon what Santilli said he saw in 92, and then adding in a few frames of the original film that had not degraded. They had not identified which frames are from the alleged original. According to Santilli, a set was constructed in the living room of an empty flat in Rochester Square, Camden Town, London. John Humphreys, an artist and sculptor, was employed to construct the two dummy alien bodies over a period of 3 weeks using casts containing sheep brains set in raspberry jam, chicken entrails, and knuckle joints obtained from S.C. Crosby Wholesale Butchers, Smithfield Meat Market, London. Humphreys also played the role of chief examiner in order to allow him to control the effects being filmed. There were 2 separate attempts at making the film footage. After filming, the team disposed of the bodies by cutting them into small pieces and placing them in rubbish bins across London. Alien artifacts, supposedly items recovered from the crash site, were depicted in the footage. These included alien symbols and a 6-figure control panel, which Santilli describes in the Sky documentary as being the result of artistic license on his part. These artifacts were also created by Humphrey. The footage also showed a man reading a statement verifying his identity as the original cameraman and the source of the footage. Santilli and Shoefield admitted in the documentary they found an unidentified homeless man on the streets of Los Angeles, persuaded him to play the role of the cameraman, and filmed him in a motel. The documentary was also released slightly modified on DVD in 2006. So before I give my thoughts, do you care to comment on any of this information, Jim?
Well, the Murdoch family that owns Fox, like, it sounds like, they had a really good Christmas that year. And they definitely took, like, if it's all a hoax, they took a good page from, the Hearst. If it's then, and Dan, like, if it's not, then, hey, like, the Murdochs still had a really good Christmas that year.
Okay, so here's the McGuire theory on this. Again, I'm not saying it's
What's
real.
weird is that, like, if it was, like, so, like, it was obviously fake, why did they have to go through all this trouble of, like, disposing of, like, the set and the body? Like, why wouldn't they just throw the whole alien body out? Like, why would they cut it into little pieces and put it in garbage bins? That in and of itself kind of sounds shady. Like, is it like that?
To me, that's actually the only thing that sounds kind of legit, including hiring a homeless guy. Because if it's a homeless guy, who's going to be able to find him and get his statement? Whereas if it was, let's say, a struggling actor, at some point someone might offer him enough money where he could come forward and say, "Oh yeah, I played that role. It was fake." Whereas by using a homeless guy, that's pretty good hedge on their part that nobody would ever find him and be able to get the information out of him that it was a hoax. Or if he did start spouting on the street corners that it was him, who would believe a random homeless guy in LA that these guys in London filmed that they were doing this autopsy in London? So, and disposing of the body, I'm guessing that's so nobody would find it, because if let's say it turned up or someone spotted it in the trash, that's the end of their whole spiel, because it's obviously fake. So by cutting it up into little pieces and spreading it around a whole bunch of different bins, they kind of protected their investment in that way.
Yeah, but, like, how come, like, if it was, like, such a good hoax, like, why didn't they make, like, more than one, like, film?
Okay, so here's the McGuire theory. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, let's say it's real for a moment. If they were threatened in some way to write it off as a hoax and even possibly paid money by the U.S. government or other parties, or legitimately threatened, they could easily just make that new statement, which it's awfully convenient that they're making this confession right before this other movie comes out. I mean, is that coincidental timing for you, Jay?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, the whole thing is a little coincidental, like, just in general. I mean, again, it could be wrapped in 1,000 different ways. I mean, the government could have, made a video that was a hoax, and then they made a video of the hoax.
That's a very good point. That is a very good point. So this guy could have honestly seen footage that might have been legitimate. Now, here's the extra point here. If this was some kind of Russian operation where they were using deformed humans, is it possible that this autopsy was of a deformed human and it's not extraterrestrial, but it is real?
I mean, that's also possible, too. I mean, I've seen some books on, deformities and such, and, they don't all just look like, the Elephant Man or John Maverick. I mean, like, some deformities are pretty extreme. I mean, they're even more extreme than the Elephant Man. So, I mean, anything is possible, but, I mean, really, anything is possible. It also could be, I mean, you got to remember, this is around the time when, we were trying to, supposedly clone humans, which we've never somehow successfully done, and then all of a sudden everyone stops talking about that. So, I mean, that could be another situation. No, seriously. When was the last time you heard someone mention that?
Now that you mention it,
but a couple decades have gone by since we were doing that. So, I mean, whatever happened to that?
Well, I think it's safe to say if they're publicly disclosing the cloning of sheep in the 90s, they were doing much more prior to the 90s.
Yeah, and, all of a sudden we just stopped talking about it. And you haven't heard anything about it in, decades. So, I mean, yeah, whatever happened to that? What I'm saying is our technology is supposedly, 5 times more superior than it was then. So, I mean, you can, I mean, all you need to do is turn on your TV and go to court TV, and they're like convicting people and like sending them to prison for life for like a saffron, strand of hair, like in some obscure like part of like a bed of a truck. But we can't do any of that. Like when it comes to like making it. So yeah, like I think that that's kind of shady.
Well, here's
in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, I could see there being like accidents and mistakes where it could be, produced. I mean, it may have not just been like a human, it might have been humanoid, but they could have crossed like human DNA with like, say, like another biped, where maybe they were experimenting with like monkeys, mixed with like human DNA, or ancestral DNA, mixing it with current DNA. There's a whole bunch of different theories that you could base off that. I'm not like, I don't know the specifics on that. I mean, I'm not like any kind of gene expert, but if you were to take two genomes, it's like if you were to take the Andromeda Galaxy and compare it to the Milky Way, like there's differences, but then there's similarities. I mean, it goes back to Jurassic Park. Like, they cross, supposedly in Jurassic Park, they crossed, frogs with prehistoric DNA.
Let me rein you in here. Let's stay focused. My final point on the alien autopsy is this. Coincidence theorists don't take the word of people when they say it's real, but they take the word of the same people when they say it's fake. Why? Why would you trust the words of humans, especially if you've already established they aren't trustworthy? So it's again, the burden of proof is on the positive claim. I'm not saying that it's real in any way. I'm just saying for those that definitively believe that it's fake based on nothing but the words of humans, that's as silly as believing it's real based on their words. Why would you believe the words of humans who can be compromised or paid off or corrupt? I mean, it's really, really silly. So that's my final point there. If footage is real, would it be the MO of government officials to pay people off to say it's fake if they want to keep something under wraps, to make false claims that it was fake?
If those people had to continue to be alive, then yes.
Good point. All right. So let's continue here. Renewed interest, 1978. In February 1978, UFO researcher Stanton Friedman interviewed Jesse Marcel, the only person known to have accompanied the Roswell debris from where it was discovered to Fort Worth, where reporters saw material that was claimed to be part of the recovered object. In November 1979, Marcel's first filmed interview was featured in a documentary titled UFOs Are Real, co-written by Friedman. The film had a limited release but was later syndicated for broadcasting.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was. They were just fragments strewn all over the area, an area about 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide.
On February 28, 1980, sensationalist tabloid The National Enquirer brought large-scale attention to the Marcel story. On September 20th, 1980, the TV series In Search Of aired an interview where Marcel described his participation in the 1947 press conference. Quote, "They wanted some comments from me, but I wasn't at liberty to do that." This guy talks like someone we know, right, JR? So all I could do is keep
I'm not really at liberty to talk about that, Bruce, but I can say that poor Leonard Nimoy was never able to shake, like, being Spock. I mean, they stuck him on In Search Of, but look at what happened. Now he's doing Roswell. Shame.
But I wasn't at liberty to do that. So all I could do is keep my mouth shut. And General Ramey is the one who told the newspapers, I mean the newsmen, what it was and to forget about it. It is nothing more than a weather observation balloon. Of course, we both knew differently. The accounts.
Well, I love the phrasing of that thing, and it's just like, yeah, wink, wink. I'm not at liberty to say anything, wink, wink. But all I can say is that I'm speaking in a robotic tone, talking about weather balloons. End of press conference.
The accounts given by Friedman and others in the following years elevated Roswell from a forgotten incident to perhaps the most famous UFO case of all time. Marcel gave a final interview to HBO's America Undercover, which aired in August 1985. In all of his statements, Marcel consistently denied the presence of bodies. Between 1978 and the early 90s, UFO researchers such as Stanton T. Friedman, William Moore, Carl T. Flock, and the team of Kevin D. Randall and Donald R. Schmidt interviewed several hundred people who claimed to have had a connection to the events at Roswell in 47. Their conclusions were that at least one alien spacecraft crashed near Roswell and a government cover-up of the incident had taken place. Are you at liberty to agree or disagree with their findings?
I'm not at liberty to do anything, but I'm not going to agree or disagree. I'm going to say this, that the government is famous for, their cover-ups. What makes their cover-ups better than other companies and other organizations' cover-ups is they have a proven track record of some of their cover-ups being real. So it adds this mystique to the fact that whether the government just says, oh, no, that didn't really happen, like, that's like them saying, well, no, we're not really going to convict you of murder, but, like, there's all this evidence that, like, they're going to take you to trial and convict you of murder. So it's like, it's kind of the same thing. It's the way that they roll the dice. In a way, it protects them. In the way, the fact that there's a conspiracy theory and the word conspiracy actually even exists protects them, because there's always going to be a level of uncertainty.
Okay, good point.
Even with MK Ultra, there's still they've admitted that finally existed, but you're never going to actually know how much they actually did, because it was conspiracy theory for so long. They're always going to be able to deny something.
That's a great point for a lot of different conspiracies. The Roswell incident in 1980. In October 1980, Marcel's story was featured in the book The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore. The authors had previously written popular books on such fringe topics as the Philadelphia Experiment and on the Bermuda Triangle. Though he was uncredited, Friedman carried out some research for the book. The book's narrative holds that an alien craft was flying over the New Mexico desert observing U.S. nuclear weapons activity, but crashed after being hit by lightning, killing the aliens on board. A government cover-up duly followed. Historian Kathy Olmsted writes that the book's narrative has come to be known as version 1 of the Roswell myth. Berlitz and Moore's narrative was dominant until the late 80s, when other authors, attracted by the commercial potential of writing about Roswell, started producing rival accounts. Debris and cover-up. The Roswell incident featured accounts of debris described in Marcel as, quote, nothing made on this earth, end quote. Additional accounts by Bill Brazel, son of rancher Mac Brazel, neighbor Floyd Proctor, and Walt Whitman Jr., son of newsman W. E. Whitman, who had interviewed Mac Brazel, suggested the material Marcel recovered had super strength not associated with a weather balloon. The book introduced the contention that debris was recovered by Marcel at the Foster Ranch, visible in photographs showing Marcel posing with the debris, was substituted for debris from a weather device as part of a cover-up. The book also claimed that the debris recovered from the ranch was not permitted a close inspection by the press. The efforts by the military were described as being intended to discredit and, quote, counteract the growing hysteria towards flying saucers, end quote. 2 accounts of witness intimidation were included in the book, including the incarceration of Mac Brazel. The authors claim to have interviewed over 90 witnesses, though the testimony of only 25 appear in the book. Only 7 of these people claim to have seen the debris. Of these, 5 claim to have handled it. First mention of alien bodies. The Roswell Incident 1980 was the first book to introduce the controversial secondhand story of civil engineer Grady Barney Barnett and a group of archaeology students from an unidentified university encountering wreckage and alien bodies while on the plains of San Agustin before being escorted away by the army. The second-hand Barnett stories were described by ufologists as the one aspect of the account that seemed to conflict with the basic story about the retrieval of highly unusual debris from a sheep ranch outside Corona, New Mexico in July 1947. Do you believe the word Corona is also just a coincidence?
I feel sorry for like the people that own the Corona like beverage company. Like they had a rough couple of years. Do you
think they'll make a massive? Do you think they'll make a massive comeback at one point, or do you think they're done?
I don't know. I heard they were actually going to change the name.
That might be wise. All right, let's continue here. Many alleged first-hand accounts of the Roswell incident actually contain information from the Aztec, New Mexico UFO incident, a hoaxed flying saucer crash which gained national notoriety after being promoted by journalist Frank Scully in his articles and a 1950 book, Behind the Flying Saucers. The hoax included stories of humanoid bodies and metals with unusual properties. And we're not going to go into the Aztec crash, the alleged Aztec crash, the alleged
Do you think
hoax.
Scully there and Scully from X-Files is coincidences?
I don't know, JR. At this point, I can't really say what is or isn't coincidence, but when the coincidence stack reaches a certain level, you might have to raise an eyebrow. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
Here's the real question, Bruce. I mean, and like we should wrap up this podcast because we don't want to we want to go into every single thing in depth. But after living through coronavirus, would it really shock the American people, if UFOs just touched down at this point?
I'm not sure, actually. Some people believe that it's Project Bluebeam, which is the U.S. faking all of these UFOs using human technology to usher in that new world order under the guise of a worldwide alien invasion and create one world government. But we're not going down that rabbit hole. But I just wanted to quickly mention that the alleged Aztec hoax, I've seen some interesting theories that purport that it actually wasn't a hoax and that the hoax was a cover-up. They covered up a real incident by making it look like a hoax to kind of divert attention. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not alleging it is true or untrue. I just wanted to add that to the information pile, and people can deduce for themselves. But let's continue here. The UFO crash at Roswell, 1991. In 1991, Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt published UFO Crash at Roswell. They added testimony from 100 new witnesses, including those who reported an elaborate military cordon and debris recovery operation at the Foster Ranch. The book included the new claims of a gouge that extended 400 or 500 feet at the ranch. Randall and Schmidt reported General Arthur Exon had been directly aware of debris and bodies, but Exon disputed his depiction, saying his comments had been based exclusively on second-hand rumors. And if they weren't, and he really did say that, would he obviously say that he didn't?
I don't know. I think all these people should run for president. I think, they'd all be really good candidates.
The 91 book sold 160,000 copies and served as the basis for the 1994 television film Roswell. Also, in 1991, retired USAF Brigadier General Thomas Dubose, who had posed with debris for press photographs in 1947, publicly acknowledged the weather balloon cover story, corroborating Marcel's previous admission. Do you find this strange? This is kind of unlike other conspiracies where there are certain military personnel who are openly admitting that it was a cover-up, and then other military personnel saying that their statements, this is all secondhand rumor nonsense.
Yeah, it depends on how badly you need your pension. And, it's also contingent on, how long did that guy live, after he said that?
That would be curious to nail all of this down. But continuing on here, the Barnett alien body accounts were mentioned in a 1991 book, although the dates and locations were changed from the accounts found in the 1980s, the Roswell incident. In this new account, Brazel was described as leading the Army to a second crash site on the ranch, at which point the Army personnel were supposedly, quote, horrified to find civilians, including Barnett, there already, end quote. Mortician's purported eyewitness account. UFO Crash at Roswell 1991 prominently featured the stories of mortician Glenn Dennis. On September 20th, 1989, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries had included secondhand stories of Barney Barnett seeing alien bodies captured by the Army. Mortician Dennis had called the show's hotline, claiming to have knowledge of the events. Dennis claimed to have received 4 or 5 calls from Airbase with questions about body preservation and inquiries about small or hermetically sealed caskets. He further claimed that a local nurse told him she had witnessed an alien autopsy. Dennis's stories of Roswell alien autopsies were the first account to allege alien corpses at the Roswell Army Air Base. Flock observed that Dennis's story sounds like a B-grade thriller conceived by Oliver Stone. In September 1991, Dennis co-founded a UFO museum in Roswell along with former RAAF Public Affairs Officer Walter Haut and Max Littell, a real estate salesman. Dennis appeared in multiple documentaries repeating his story. Randall deemed Glenn Dennis one of the least credible Roswell witnesses. Randall said Dennis was not credible for changing the name of the nurse once we had proved she didn't exist. Scientific skeptic author Brian Dunning concurs that Dennis cannot be regarded as a reliable witness, considering that he had seemingly waited over 40 years before he started recounting a series of unconnected events. Such events, Dunning argues, were then arbitrarily joined together to form what had become the most popular narrative of the alleged alien crash. Some prominent ufologists, including Carl T. Flock, Kent Jeffrey, and William L. Moore, have become convinced that there were no aliens or alien spacecraft involved in the Roswell crash. So here's a couple issues I have here that I believe you'll also want to address. One, if they really feared for their lives, and then later on, decades later, they realize telling the truth is more important. I mean, we've seen this with a lot of things, like forget conspiracies and the paranormal. We've seen this in true crime cases where people come forward decades after the fact because they realize they're not going to live forever and they want the truth to be known. So why would that be? I mean, how are you using that as a metric for saying they're lying?
Well, okay, so in this particular case, it's not like, you know, they fit together with an independent examination of the situation per se. You know, Roswell has been documented in so many different ways. It's kind of like a pick your poison type of conspiracy, which is great for the government because they could just be like, what quack did you read, you know, that from? So they, you know, like I said, they can just deny whatever because unless they come with some physical evidence, which the physical evidence has long been removed and, like, you know, either put in a bunker or didn't exist in the first place.
We'll actually be discussing that in at a later point, physical evidence. But yeah, no, I think it's kind of silly to say that somebody wouldn't confess on their deathbed or wouldn't confess decades later or wouldn't make maybe they just felt safer with the internet and publicity where they could come forward, whereas back in the day, people could be made to disappear and nobody would ever even know. Not that they can't do that now, but it's a little harder now if you're always on Twitter and then one day you're not.
True, but you could also, you know, not to play devil's advocate, but like you could also say on the deathbed, like you're not like necessarily, those people aren't necessarily in the same mental state that they were back when they were healthy and, like, you know, spry. You know what I mean?
It depends. Yeah, it depends on what they're dying from. Yes, it depends. So it always depends. But to just blanketly say they're lying because they waited this long, that's kind of silly. And then regarding the nurse, which we'll be getting into as well, we might have to actually do a dedicated episode on the nurse. But the nurse, is it possible he changed the name of the nurse because he wanted to protect her because she didn't want to come forward? How is that not a possibility?
I mean, that's possible. I mean, anything is possible. Like, it's true she might not exist. It could be that, you know, she gave him a false name. It could be that, you know, like, it was kind of a, take the money and run type situation. It could be that he based the nurse off of, it could have been a guy, and he made it a girl. It could be, like, he just fabricated an identity around what was said to him by somebody else. Maybe it wasn't a nurse. Maybe it was, a surgical tech. There's a whole bunch of different...
Conversely, as with the Bob Lazar situation, which we'll be doing an episode on him, of course, down the line, but with Bob Lazar, people saying that, there's no records of his academic history. If Lazar is claiming that the government erased him and his records, there not being records doesn't prove him wrong. It's in the category of proving him right. Of course, you can't prove a negative, but it doesn't disprove him. It wouldn't that prove? I mean, you still have to prove that that's what they did. But the fact that it doesn't exist when he's claiming it was erased, I mean, what does that prove, really? So
it's been proven that I mean, like, there's one guy that, I'm not going to name names, but there is one incident that I can recount of someone that, I wasn't associated with this individual, but, like, it was common water cooler chatter that, he was up on trial for murder, and he was like, I worked for the CIA, and they kind of laughed like they, probably always do, and I think they put him in a psych ward. Well, they went to actually check his background, and it was completely gone. So, I mean, he's obviously real. They ran his fingerprints, and it didn't come back with anything. So, I mean,
exactly.
Obviously, so that type of thing can actually happen.
Well,
whether or not, 99% of those people turn out to be nut jobs, but there is that 1%.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. And to hallucinate that it can't or wouldn't be, I mean, even with Lazar, they didn't dot all their I's and cross all their T's. They actually did find an Office of Naval Intelligence pay stub for Lazar. Because all of the coincidence theorists that were saying Lazar was crazy and never worked for anything related to the government, they actually did find a paper trail. And I believe Lazar himself might have been surprised that they were able to find it. I don't remember exactly. I think he was in court for possibly some kind of divorce or custody thing. I don't remember exactly what he was in court for, but they actually did find a record of him being paid by naval intelligence, which was funny because the coincidence theorists always want to pretend that that's not true. But anyway, if there really was a nurse and the nurse was erased, then what? Because if the conspiracy is true, obviously these are things that could be done. Now, I'm not alleging it's true. I'm not alleging it was done. But to hallucinate that it can't be done, I mean, that's kind of silly. Let's continue here. Competing Accounts and Schism, 1992. In 1992, Stanton Friedman released Crash at Corona, co-authored with Don Berliner. The book introduced new witnesses and added to the narrative by doubling the number of flying saucers to 2 and the number of aliens to 8, 2 of which were said to have survived and been taken into custody by the U.S. government. In 1994, Randall and Schmidt authored another book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, which included a claim that alien bodies were taken by cargo plane to be viewed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, can you dispute that? Because doesn't the president, in the famous movie Independence Day, didn't they verify that the president didn't have the clearance for this?
Not necessarily. The president has compartmented clearance, just like, a lot of high-ranking people have compartmented clearance. So the day-to-day operations, basically his cabinet lets him know what's pertinent to his role in the government, or is supposed to. Except, like, when it comes to people like Trump, like, when the whole family is involved.
Well, yeah, we don't need to get into that, but...
Yeah, we're not getting into political. Like, I don't want to get into political. That door swings both ways.
So you're saying the presidents of the past would have had clearance to view alien bodies?
Not necessarily, but you also have to remember that Dwight Eisenhower was also like military general at the time. So
okay, that's a good point.
Like he was general of the armies, I believe. I'm pretty sure. So. Yeah, like he had he's the 5-star. So as being like the top, and then he becomes president, he would be more clear than 90% of everybody else.
So you're saying Eisenhower might have had military clearance, whereas other presidents would not have had the clearance to see his body.
Yeah, well, he definitely had the clearance because he was the general of the armies. So like he was 5-star. Like he
Okay.
was as high as you can
And I'm
possibly
gonna-
go. And then he became elected. As in just a purely elected person, possibly not. But he, as general of the armies, he had access to every compartment and piece of information that the army or any other branch had at the time. So, and also he was general of the armies before the Roswell incident took place, and probably I think he was still during. So, like his clearance would have still been active at that point in time.
Okay,
So-
thanks for that clarification. And this is also a moment where I'm going to give another McGuire observation. So up to, I would say, 1991, possibly even just the 1980 account, Roswell incident. Once we're adding here to some people believe Stanton Friedman is controlled opposition. He's controlled opposition or some kind of government shill, intentionally muddying the waters. Now, doesn't this smell like a muddying of the waters where you have Friedman in 92 coming up? Now there's a second flying saucer. Now there's double the bodies. Now there's just, it's such a big mess. Was that done on purpose to obfuscate the real truth about Roswell?
I mean, that's possible too, but I mean, the more likely scenario is, I mean, it holds less credibility, frankly, because he was second in line, so it kind of almost looks like a clone of, like a duplicate. Kind of like how, like, Family Guy has, like, really funny jokes, but really a lot of them are originally from The Simpsons. You know, that kind of thing. Like,
Okay, so
it's a rehash.
Well, let's take a step back and look at this objectively. I don't want to fall for appeal to incredulity to logical fallacy. So maybe there were 2 crashes, but doesn't that just smell funny on the surface? That all of a sudden now there's 2 alien crashes with double the body. Like, does that pass the sniff test for you?
No, it doesn't, because, I mean, like, the fact that it happened at the same exact place is shady. That right there is what I would consider a flag.
Yeah, no, definitely, no doubt. And it also puts Stanton Friedman under the microscope, because if he's muddying the waters to this degree, or he's just in it for the fame, then he can't really be trusted, can you? Do you have a personal opinion on Stanton Friedman? I mean, he's one of the most famous ufologists.
Well, I mean, again, you get famous, and you're that famous because you like to throw yourself into the center of an equation. So, I think that he's probably that much of a ufologist to where, you know, he needs to leave a part of himself on that particular incident.
All right,
I mean, that would be my first. I'm not just necessarily discrediting what, like, the guy said, but at the end of the day, it just doesn't pass any sniff test for me. It passes, you know, oh, okay, and then you put the bracelets on, like that's the sniff test. You know, like when you walk up to a car and it's like, oh, like I only had 2 beers, and like you just see like this, like,
is that your polite
large
way?
sign on him.
Friedman's.
Yeah, he's full of shit. I think he's you know, it's pretty safe to say.
Well, I was gonna phrase it as there's an aroma of manure around this theory.
Manure is a very 5-cent word in that circumstance. I think we could just say it's just pure shit. But I mean,
all right, so let's continue his account here with his competing claims. Crash at Corona. The existence of so many differing accounts led to a schism among ufologists about the events at Roswell. The Center for UFO Studies, CUFOS, and the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, 2 leading UFO societies, disagreed in their views at the various scenarios presented by Randall Schmidt and Friedman Berliner. Several conferences were held to try to resolve the differences. You got to hand them credit for how far out of their way they're going to try to find common ground at what happened at Roswell. Do you see this with other conspiracies?
the most credible conspiracies are where it's just some random Joe turning a wrench or, like, you know, like shimmying like up like an electrical pole, and like he sees something that like he never thought, or it just happens to be in the general vicinity of something that's going on that, you know, does, like, when you have to say all of this shit just to make yourself sound credible, like, there's, again, flag. I mean, we're not even at the flag level anymore. Now we're at the smoke signal level, like where it's just like, you know, I mean, there's only one other level, and that's like the blaring siren level. So
Well,
yeah,
we're about to. I think we might be about to get to that. One issue under discussion was where Barnett was when he saw the alien craft he was said to have encountered. A 1992 UFO conference attempted to achieve a consensus among the various scenarios portrayed in Crash at Corona and UFO Crash at Roswell. However, the publication, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, resolved the Barnett problem by simply ignoring Barnett and citing a new location for the alien craft recovery, including a new group of archaeologists not connected to the ones the Barnett story cited. Are we at the blaring sirens yet, JR?
you're at the blaring air horn at this point, Bruce. But yeah, no, like I obviously there's just like this rush to cash in on, you know.
But
I mean,
it's kind of strange.
I'm not saying that he's.
They're not even attempting to rectify these issues. They're just manufacturing new data points out of thin air.
Well, it was the '90s, so I mean, you know, like a lot of things are manufactured.
Let's examine the Air Force response. 1994 to 97, after U.S. congressional inquiries, the General Accounting Office launched an inquiry and directed the Office of the U.S. Secretary of the Air Force to conduct an internal investigation. The result was summarized in two reports. The first, released in 1994, concluded that the material recovered in 1947 was likely debris from Project Mogul, a military surveillance program employing high-altitude balloons and classified portion of an unclassified New York University project by atmospheric researchers. The second report, released in 1997, concluded that reports of recovered alien bodies were likely a combination of innocently transformed memories of accidents involving military casualties with memories of the recovery of anthropomorphic dummies in military programs such as the 1950s Operation High Dive, mixed with hoaxes perpetrated by various witnesses and UFO proponents. The psychological effects of time compression and confusion about when the events occurred explained the discrepancy with the years in question. Now, what do you think of that convenient summation by the Air Force?
Well, I would like to pause and like just tell the audience that's listening to this that these are the congressmen that you elected to perform this inquiry, and every time you pay Uncle Sam, your tax dollars fund these particular operations and, you know, create pension plans for people like me. And you should pause this program, turn to the nearest American flag, and salute it and capitalism in general, and be proud that, you know, it's allowed you to listen to this podcast.
All right, JR, let's focus here because are they even trying? They're basically summing this all up. Oh, people misremember because military personnel are killed in wars, and there might have been some dummies in the 50s, and people simply misremembered. Is that convincing to you, JR?
Well, most of the things that the Congress said like aren't very convincing to me.
All right,
I think it's kind of interesting that like they're working on that instead of like every time you see a Feed the Children commercial working on that. But like, hey, you know, like I'm just a simple government employee. I'm not necessarily anyone important like they are.
By the 1990s, a scholarly consensus emerged concluding that the military decided to conceal the true purpose of the crash device, nuclear test monitoring, and instead informed the public that the crash was of a weather balloon. The balloon had been launched from Alamogordo Army Airfield a month earlier. It carried a radar reflector and classified Project Mogul sensors for experimental monitoring of Soviet nuclear testing. Now, if they were gonna make up stories to conceal the true nature of something, why wouldn't they make up that it was a weather balloon to conceal an alien spacecraft? I mean, if these scholarly consensuses, what's the plural of consensus? Is it consensi?
I have no idea.
Consensuses. If
You have to ask Maxwell that one.
yeah, the consensuses or consensi, if they're saying the U.S. government is capable of concealing the true purpose of things by making other things up, then by nature they're also admitting that if it were an alien spacecraft of some kind, the U.S. government would conceal it. So, okay. The Air Force reports were dismissed by UFO proponents as being either disinformation or simply implausible. Though skeptical researchers such as Philip J. Klass and Robert Todd, who had been expressing doubts regarding accounts of aliens for several years, used the reports as the basis for skeptical responses by claims by UFO proponents. After the release of the Air Force reports, several books such as Cal Korff's The Roswell UFO Crash, What They Don't Want You to Know, 1997, built on the evidence presented in the reports to conclude, quote, there is no credible evidence that the remains of an extraterrestrial spacecraft was involved, end quote. Alien autopsy footage, 95. In 95, film footage purporting to show an alien autopsy and claimed to have been taken by U.S. military officials shortly after the Roswell incident was released by Ray Santilli, a London-based video entrepreneur. The footage caused an international sensation when it aired on television networks around the world. Santilli admitted in 2006 that the film was mostly a reconstruction, but continued to claim it was based on genuine footage now lost, and some original frames had supposedly survived. A fictionalized version of the creation of the footage and its release was retold in the comedy film Alien Autopsy 2006, coincidentally lining up with Santilli's admission. We already talked about that. The day after Roswell, 1997. In 1997, former Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso reported in his autobiographical book, The Day After Roswell, that the Roswell crash did happen, and that was when he was assigned to Fort Riley, Kansas. Is it pronounced Kansas or Kansas?
What's that again?
Is Kansas pronounced Kansas or Kansas or Kansas?
I think it depends on if you went to public school or private school and like what wing of the America you're from.
I've never been to Kansas. Have you been to Kansas?
I'm really not at liberty to say. Bruce.
Okay, all right. In July 1947, a sergeant showed him purportedly non-human bodies that were from an air crash. Corso further claimed that years later he helped oversee a project to reverse engineer recovered crash debris. Philip Klass analyzed his claims line by line and exposed many inconsistencies and factual errors. Corso's story was noted for its similarities to the film Terminator 2, which had been released 6 years prior. In that film, civilians secretly attempt to reverse engineer extraordinary technology of unknown origin. So here's my take on this situation. Why do so-called skeptics or researchers, why do they expect people that come forward with these stories to be 100% sane? Because let's say his story is true. Let's say Corso was involved in all these top secret operations, was shown alien bodies, might have, maybe he was even experimented on himself, MK Ultra, other experiments. Why would his accounts have to be consistent or untrue? What is with all these false dichotomy logical fallacies where if someone isn't 100% consistent, that must mean they're lying? Like, why is there no room for people involved in these highly incredible situations to be traumatized mentally to the point where they wouldn't be consistent even if they were trying to tell the truth?
I'll explain why, Bruce. You'd have to take a page, instead of taking a page out of Terminator 2, though, you have to take a page out of Spaceballs. It's all about merchandising. You have the camp that wants you to believe that their story is real, and you have the camp that wants you to believe that the story is fake. It's kind of like politics. Like, you got, like, the blue and the red, and then there's all those people in between that are, like, trying to, be the next blue or red. So, it's the same thing. Like, there are those that are telling the truth, or at least they believe they're telling the truth in each camp, okay? But then you have, like, those people that are not middle of the aisle people, the ones that want to profiteer off the situation in general. They cloud the waters, which is why everything becomes gray.
Okay, that's a good explanation.
If everyone was shot with truth serum and they were thrown into a room, you'd have a much better, understanding that, like, these people are full of shit and these people are telling the truth. I mean, like, it doesn't always work, but I mean, in most cases.
I'm going to add to the gray area, because what if Corso is part of some MK Ultra project where he was told to say this for the purpose of being discredited, but in his own mind, MK Ultra controlled mind, he is saying the truth, whether it is or isn't?
I mean, that's possible, but I mean, like, a lot of times, again, it's not like he ever sat down and did, like, a polygraph or anything. I mean, like, even those are, like, considered highly questionable. So, I mean, it's kind of like, like, what? It depends. I mean, he could have just been simply offered money and a pension, and he doesn't necessarily have to be brainwashed. I mean, there are people that are just eager to, like, work for the government, or eager to, like.
So let's look at this guy's resume. I mean, he served in the U.S. Army from February 23rd, 1942 to March 1st, 1963. Earned the rank of lieutenant colonel. Okay. He was also on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell, where he talks about the Roswell story. He died of a heart attack less than a year later. Is that suspicious, JR? So he doesn't talk for all these years.
It's standard procedure.
So he doesn't talk for all these years. As soon as he publishes his book in 97 and he's on the radio in 97, he does not survive a year.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, again, Bruce, like, back to the washing hands thing. Like,
well, also, hold on a second. There's some plausible deniability, because the guy was 83. So, I mean, if he's beyond life...
Yeah, well, that could also be looked at as very convenient. I mean,
it can. Yes, it can. But so, he actually served in Army intelligence in Europe. He was actually the chief of U.S. counterintelligence in Rome in 1942. In 45, he arranged for the safe passage of 10,000 World War II refugees out of Rome to the British Mandate of Palestine. He was the personal emissary to Giovanni Battista Montini at the Vatican, later Pope Paul VI, during the period when the Nazi rat lines were most active. During the Korean War from 50 to 53, Corso performed intelligence duties under General Douglas MacArthur as chief of the Special Projects Branch of the Intelligence Division Far East Command. One of his primary duties was to keep track of enemy prisoner of war camps in North Korea. Corso was in charge of investigating the estimated number of U.S. and other UN POWs held at each camp and their treatment. At later hearings in 92 of the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs, Corso provided first-hand testimony that many hundreds of American POWs were abandoned at these camps. McCain stated that his knowledge obtained from those who had personal relationships with Eisenhower led him to believe that Eisenhower was just not capable of allowing known American POWs to remain incarcerated after the termination of the Korean War. Corso was on staff at President Eisenhower's National Security Council for 4 years between 1953 and 1957. In 1961, he became chief of the Pentagon's Foreign Technology Desk in Army Research and Development, working under Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau. So this is a guy who's had an incredibly established career. This is not the type of guy that typically comes out randomly with Roswell claims.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if you're that successful and you have, like, that size of a pension, like, I mean, you could basically just say, like, look, the sky is, like, green. And, like, and when people ask, well, no, General, the sky isn't green, you just point to the northern lights. You know what I mean? Like, at that point, like, he doesn't have to give a shit. But at the same time, he could be telling the truth. See, like, the thing is, like, he can just say whatever he wants. I mean, someone that's that powerful, like, he might just be empowered by, like, just telling people stuff. And, like, the fact that, like, they believe it, he might get off on that. I mean, there's a couple
of curiosities in this book, though. And I know you're going to have issue with one thing I'm about to say, but I'm going to summarize it anyway. So in his book, Day After Roswell, Corso claims he stewarded extraterrestrial artifacts recovered from a crash near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Corso says a covert government group was assembled under the leadership of Admiral Roscoe H. Hillenkotter, the first director of Central Intelligence, Majestic 12. Among its tasks was to collect all information on off-planet technology, The U.S. administration simultaneously discounted the existence of flying saucers in the eyes of the public, Corso said. According to Corso, the reverse engineering of these artifacts indirectly led to the development of accelerated particle beam devices, fiber optics, lasers, integrated circuit chips, and Kevlar material. In the book, Corso also claims Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, was meant to achieve the destructive capacity of electronic guidance systems in incoming enemy warheads, as well as the disabling of enemy spacecraft, including those of extraterrestrial origin. So I know you don't want to talk about Majestic 12. I don't know why, but you seem to not ever want to talk about Majestic 12. But Corso is saying all of these things. So why would he be saying this if this is all not true?
Well, I'm not like 100% saying that it's not all true. What I'm saying is that like with the government, I mean, again, you also have to look at it from the time period in which you're looking at it from. At the time, Russia was winning the space race. So obviously they would want like international information on where everyone was on their planetary knowledge. I'm saying things like that. It's not necessarily that like, you know, what he's saying about like Roswell specifically is not like 100% true. But there are other reasons why they had that program.
Okay, and we're not going to go down the Majestic 12 rabbit hole, but for those people that don't know...
Yeah, we're not talking about Majestic 12, Bruce. I've told you like multiple times.
I'm not asking you any questions. Just for the people that don't know, supposedly Majestic 12 was formed, supposedly authorized by President Harry S. Truman in 1952 as a direct result of the July 1947 crash and how the technology could be used. So, and there's various memos and documentation, which again, supposedly the documents are all legit, but that doesn't mean it's true. It could be a disinfo campaign. So these documents could be manufactured by the U.S. government for the sole purpose of disinfo or misinfo. And so that doesn't mean that the Majestic 12 program was authentic, although there have been many people that have come forward to claim that it is. Okay, so final thoughts on Corso? The guy's 83 years old. The book comes out. He actually, not only does the book come out and not misquote him, he himself goes on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell and recounts in his own words, verifying that he did in fact say these things, and then less than a year later he's dead. But he's also 83, so again, there's some plausible deniability. Do you find it strange that all these massive leaps in technology all occurred directly after Roswell and not before?
Well, that's possible, but then it's also possible that, like, you know, the government was just, like, letting the people know that, like, the technology existed around that time. And he felt compelled to, you know, say something.
All right, so let's look at the HOT document 2007. In 2007, Donald Schmidt and Tom Carey published the book Witness to Roswell, which prominently featured a document said to be a sworn affidavit by Walter Haut, who had written the first Army press release about the Roswell crash in 1947. The document, alleged to have been left by Haut and opened only after his death in 2005, includes a description of the 1947 crash debris having been discussed by high-ranking staff and how Haut had seen alien bodies. The claims, however, drew an unimpressed response even from ufologists. Dennis Balthaser said that the document was not written by Haut, and by 2000, Haut's mental state was such he could not recall basic details about his past, making the detail contained in the affidavit seem dubious. Physicist and skeptic Dave Thomas commented, "Is Roswell still the best UFO incident? If it is, UFO proponents should be very, very worried." On October 26, 2007, Bill Richardson, who at the time was a candidate for the Democratic Party nomination for U.S. president, was asked about releasing government files on Roswell. Richardson responded that when he was a congressman, he attempted to get information on behalf of his New Mexico constituents, but was told by both the Department of Defense and Los Alamos labs that the information was classified. "That ticked me off," he said. "The government doesn't tell the truth as much as it should on a lot of issues." He promised to work on opening the files if he were elected president. And we seem to, like, a lot of people say that, but then nobody actually releases anything. What do you make of that, JR?
Well, honestly, Bruce, that's really not surprising. Because they're hoping it'll go away.
All right, let's move on to the Stalin-Mengele conspiracy theories. This is what I mentioned earlier from Annie Jacobsen. This was in 2011. In 2011, American journalist Annie Jacobsen's Area 51, An Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base, featured a claim that Joseph Mengele, a German SS officer and a doctor in Auschwitz, was recruited by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to produce grotesque child-sized aviators to be remotely piloted and landed in America in order to cause hysteria similar to Orson Welles' The War of the World. The book was criticized for extensive errors by scientists from the Federation of American Scientists. Historian Richard Rhodes, writing in the Washington Post, also criticized the book's sensationalistic reporting of old news and its error-ridden reporting. He wrote, all of her main sources' claims appear in one or another of the various publicly available Roswell UFO Area 51 books and documents churned out by believers, charlatans, and scholars over the past 60 years. In attributing the stories, she reports to an unnamed engineer and Manhattan Project veteran, while seemingly failing to conduct even minimal research into the man's sources. Jacobsen shows herself, at a minimum, extraordinarily gullible or journalistically incompetent. And again, there's a lot more to the story. I actually have not read her book in full, but there were documents, even, I believe, back in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were recovered documents that were leaked. Maybe they're not real, but there was some documentation that alleged that the craft was Soviet in origin, or at least that the U.S. believed it was. Do you have any thoughts on this theory? Any further thoughts?
Well, I mean, like, even if they're fake, like, you know, Russia probably wanted to believe that, like, we thought, like, you know, that, like, they had done it, even if they didn't have anything to do with it. and knowing the Russians, they wouldn't just, like, they wouldn't say anything. They should have no comment.
That's a good point as well. So that is a good point. Continued debunking 2017 to 2020. In September 2017, UK newspaper The Guardian reported on Kodachrome slides, which some had claimed to show a dead space alien, first presented at a Be Witness event in Mexico, organized by Jamie Mousen and attended by almost 7,000 people. Days afterwards, it was revealed that the slides were in fact of a mummified Native American child discovered in 1896, which had been on display in the Chapin Mesa Archaeological Museum in Mesa Verde, Colorado for many decades. How many decades, though? Because if it was from the Roswell Crash. In February 2020, an Air Force historian revealed a recently declassified report of a circa 1951 incident in which two Roswell personnel donned poorly fitting radioactive suits complete with oxygen masks while retrieving a weather balloon after an atomic test. On one occasion, they encountered a lone woman in the desert who fainted when she saw them. The personnel could have appeared to someone unaccustomed to then modern gear to be alien. That's an interesting point that you don't hear discussed a lot. Is it possible that there were nuclear tests or people in primitive hazmat type suits that individuals back in the 40s, 50s, 60s even, they wouldn't have seen anything like it, and they might have thought that they were travelers from other worlds? The only problem I see with that theory is that eyewitnesses always report these humanoids as being really, really small. So it's not like they're reported to be 6 feet tall. They're always reported to be like 4 feet tall or even 3 feet tall. So that's the only issue I see with that theory. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you know, there's a couple things. First of all, The Guardian isn't really regarded, like, in my brain anyway, as, like, the most reliable source of information. And it's been time-tested that they're owned by, like, the, you know, political powerhouse of the time. So I'm not, like, 100% on them. In terms of the radioactive suits, I think that's perfectly plausible, especially since, like, it was sensationalized in the 30s and 40s with, like, you know, the whole sci-fi, like, moving into the 60s. I will say that, like, you know, 40s, I mean, to be quite blunt, and people probably will disagree with me on this, but child labor laws aren't exactly what they are today, and to be quite to be quite frank, when you're talking about the United States military, you're talking about it was only 20 years off from when, like, kids were sweeping chimneys and shit. So I wouldn't really surprise me if they didn't have, like, a specific program for that. Or, I mean, even in World War II, like, 16 and 17-year-olds were, like, operating guns and shit, like, on ships. It's not unheard of.
Do you think they just viewed midgets as disposable and they put them in hazmat suits and wanted them to collect stuff just in case the radiation was too strong and they'd be killed?
That's possible. What's also possible is that, like, regionally, there might have not been, like, there wasn't, like, grocery stores like there is today. So people could have had mineral deficiencies and stuff that, like, just naturally made them small. There's, like, a bunch of different, like, conspiracies that can be derived just from that statement.
All right, so that's the official narrative. We're going to close this episode out with the evidence in the official narrative. Again, this is the mainstream version dissected. Although there is no evidence that a UFO crashed at Roswell, again, this is the official narrative. Obviously, this is a disputed claim. Believers firmly hold to the belief that one did and that the truth has been concealed as a result of a government conspiracy. B.D. Gildenberg has called the Roswell incident the world's most famous, most exhaustively investigated, and most thoroughly debunked UFO claim. Flock said the case for Roswell is a classic example of the triumph of quantity over quality. The advocates of the crashed saucer tale simply shovel everything that seems to support their view into the box marked evidence and say, see, look at all this stuff, we must be right. Never mind the contradiction. Never mind the lack of independent supporting fact. Never mind the blatant absurdities. Korf suggests there are clear incentives for some people to promote the idea of aliens at Roswell and that many researchers were not doing competent work. The UFO field is comprised of people who are willing to take advantage of the gullibility of others, especially the paying public. Let's not pull any punches here. The Roswell UFO myth has been very good business for UFO groups, publishers, for Hollywood, the town of Roswell, the media, and ufology. The number of researchers...
And for the government.
Well, yeah. The number of researchers who employ science and its disciplined methodology is appallingly small. And coincidentally, everything he said also applies to the coincidence theory. Because any kind of contradiction, they immediately into the box marked debunked and say, see, look at all the contradictions, we must be right. So everything he said was also pretty accurate psychological projection on his part regarding the coincidence theorist.
Yeah, and it's a very centered answer because, to be honest, like, one of the biggest gray areas is the fact that when you just take everything and throw it into the box marked evidence, what do you think the government does? So when you're fighting fire with fire, you're going to get fire. So it's perfect.
Yeah, so, and then obviously he's also saying advantage...
That guy was on debate team in high school.
He's also saying that about these people who are willing to take advantage of the gullibility of others, especially the paying public, because the government never does that with taxpayers, right? The guys...
Yeah, again, fire with fire. Like, it's all the way down the line.
Yeah, Flock is pretty goofy across the board here. B.D. Gildenberg wrote that there were as many as 11 reported alien recovery sites, and these recoveries bore only a marginal resemblance to the event as initially reported in 1947 or as recounted later by the initial witnesses. Some of these new accounts could have been confused accounts of the several known recoveries of injured and dead servicemen from 4 military plane crashes that occurred in the area from 1948 to 1950. Were they all tiny midgets? Other accounts could also be based on memories of recoveries of test dummies, as suggested by the Air Force in their reports. Charles Ziegler argued that the Roswell stories has all the hallmarks of a traditional folk narrative. He identified 6 distinct narratives and a process of transmission via storytellers with a core story that was crafted from various witness accounts and was then shaped and molded by those who carry on the UFO community's tradition. Other witnesses were then sought out to expand the core narrative, with those giving accounts not in line with the core beliefs being repudiated or simply omitted by the gatekeepers. Others then retold the narrative in its new form. This whole process would repeat over time. So, is that evidence of the event being real, and then the folklore emerging as a result from it, like other folklore based on real
it's possible. I'll also say something else about the midgets. Like, I'm actually going to say that it's possible, because when you look at it objectively as from an engineering standpoint, like, why do they use midgets in horse racing? Because they're lighter weight and they're more aerodynamic because there's less surface area and they can haunch over the horse and be faster.
So are you alleging the US
wait. In a possible covert ops situation with smaller aircraft, it would enable the aircraft itself to be smaller, more compact, and more lightweight. So it is possible.
So the US military were just contracting jockeys.
Possibly.
That's a good theory, JR. That's a really
plausible deniability. I mean, like, it's the same thing with MK Ultra. Like, let's use people that aren't military, because, like, there's always
that's a really,
if they get captured or something.
Those are all really good points. Just the one final point here regarding Gildenberg here, saying that, these new accounts could be confused accounts of injured and dead servicemen. I mean, yeah, they could be, or they could be aliens. I mean, anything could be. He's saying there's no evidence of the aliens, but is there any evidence that they were confused accounts? So they're just pretending and writing it off as confused accounts without any evidence that they were confused accounts. So there's just the irony here of these hypocrites that dismiss while committing the same faults as true believers who believe no matter what. So the problem with witness accounts, though hundreds of people were interviewed by various researchers, only a few of these people claim to have seen debris or aliens. Most witnesses were just repeating the claims of others. Flock notes that of these 300 plus individuals reportedly interviewed for UFO crash at Roswell in 1991, only 41 can be considered genuine first or second-hand witnesses, and only 23 can be reasonably thought to have seen physical evidence of debris. Of these, only 7 have asserted anything suggestive of otherworldly origins for the debris. But as if 7 is 1? I mean, it's not like it's 1 or 2 crazy people. I mean, 7 is a lot of witnesses, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's.
I mean, that's not one or 2 crazy people. So, okay.
But again, like, they could be plants from the government too, like,
that's a good point.
To stir the pot.
That's a very good point.
Because when you look at it objectively, it almost seems like the type of number that the military would use. It's not too much. Think about it. It's not a 4-piece play setting. It's not a 6-piece play setting. It's not a 12-piece play setting. It's an 8-piece play setting. So it covers both small and large groups. It's like,
that's a good
kind
point.
of like in the middle.
And that's another thing these so-called debunkers fail to even comprehend. It's like they don't have the mental capacity to look at all these theories objectively. If you haven't checked out the Mindshock episode, Debunking Debunkers, I go through all of this as well. In the Roswell incident, Marcel stated, quote, "Actually, this material may have looked like tinfoil and balsa wood, but the resemblance ended there. They took one picture of me on the floor holding up some of the less interesting metallic debris. The stuff in that one photo was pieces of the actual stuff we found. It was not a staged photo," end quote. Timothy Printy points out that the material Marcel positively identified as being part of what he recovered is material the skeptics and UFO advocates agree is debris from a balloon device. After that fact was pointed out to him, Marcel changed his story to say that the material was not what he recovered. Skeptics like Robert Todd argued that Marcel had a history of embellishment and exaggeration, such as claiming to have been a pilot and having received 5 air medals for shooting down enemy planes, claims that were all found to be false, and skeptics feel that his evolving Roswell story was simply another instance of his tendency to fabricate. So let me dissect this, because there's so many issues here with Marcel. So first of all, if this were a conspiracy, could they not have switched photographs? I mean,
it's possible. Like, it's actually more probable that, like, the legitimate stuff would be, like, innocuous.
Exactly.
Garbage.
And then another point is, and 2 more points here. Let's say Marcel was one of these guys that tells tall tales. If a flying saucer did crash and he was the one to recover it, how that didn't happen because he also tells tall tales? I mean, a certain portion of the population embellish stories. Let's say 5%. It might be higher. So of that 5%, how are you going to say that because he's an embellisher, that means there's no chance he would have been present at a particular event. If he's the guy that was there, he's the guy that was there, whether he's an embellisher or not. So again, these kind of logical fallacies are so silly. And furthermore, let's say his claims about shooting down enemy planes, is it possible, when they say it's all found to be false, again, is this an instance of the government going back and erasing information to try to discredit people? Because if he is telling the truth and the U.S. government doesn't want him to, would they erase some of his past to make him less credible?
Possibly. I mean, yes. If he was working for them during specific points in time, they would attempt to distance themselves from him at any cost.
So yeah, there's a lot of fallacies that the so-called debunkers cling to, and again,
but you also have to they have to pay people to distance themselves. So they would only do that in the event that he had something really damning, which it doesn't sound like it's that incredibly damning.
Well, also, I'm not saying anything Marcel said is true. I'm just saying the debunkers are just, all they have is fallacies to support debunking his story. The problems with alien body witnesses. As for the accounts from those who claim to have seen aliens, critics identified problems ranging from the reliability of secondhand accounts to credibility problems with witnesses making demonstrably false claims or multiple contradictory accounts to dubious deathbed confessions or accounts from elderly and easily confused witnesses. Flock noted that only 4 people with supposed first-hand knowledge of alien bodies were interviewed by Roswell authors. All reports of bodies came about a minimum of 31 years after the fact. And I'm actually not sure that's true. I believe there's one memo that references an account at the time. We'll be going into that in the next episode. But this, and also 4 people, that's also more than one person. And all of everything that's just stated here with the problems with witnesses, demonstrably false claims, multiple contradictory accounts, dubious deathbed confessions, all of these are controls. There's a certain percentage of that exists with all real situations. I mean, look at the JFK assassination. There's a whole bunch of conflicting reports on who saw what and how he was shot. That doesn't mean he wasn't shot. Right? Yeah. So, I mean, you could look at even in recent times where you have people with cell phone footage at certain events where whatever event happened, you have contradictory claims at every single event, even events that are known to have happened. So this silliness in saying that these 100% of witnesses are not reliable, therefore it didn't happen, that's really, really silly.
Yeah.
Okay, another point here, grays and false memory syndrome. In popular lore, grays are said to be the creatures whose flying saucer crashed near Roswell in 1947. Various claims have the grays' bodies found among the wreckage, while others assert that some survived. However, no mention of alien bodies related to the Roswell incident occurs until 1980. Again, I'm not 100% sure that's true. Again, we're just looking at the Wikipedia here. In later episodes, we will examine other claims for veracity. In the interval between 1947 and 1980, the idea of gray aliens had entered the public consciousness, beginning with the Betty and Barney Hill incident. In December 1963, Betty Hill and her husband Barney sought out a psychiatrist after Betty experienced recurring nightmares. On February 10, 1964, the ABC network broadcast an episode of the science fiction television show The Outer Limits that featured an extraterrestrial with large wraparound eyes. 12 days later, during a hypnosis session, Barney Hill told his psychiatrist a story about being a being with wraparound eyes. Modern psychiatric consensus is that Hill experienced false memory syndrome, in which therapy methods such as hypnosis led to confabulation. And you know what's curious? I don't recall the details, but didn't they not have a TV? So they were not able to see that episode. Is that I believe that's what some people have asserted. I don't know if they ever nailed down whether they can prove, because if they can prove that they never saw the episode, then what? On October 20th, 1975, the NBC network aired a made-for-TV movie inspired by the Hills, starring James Earl Jones. Depictions of gray aliens would go on to appear in a number of books, films, television shows, such as the 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Is that your favorite film, Jared?
I'm not at liberty to say it.
Grays would later be incorporated into the Roswell legend. And again, in later episodes, we will be examining the true root of these grays. I mean, there's even grays on cave paintings and part of Native American legends and lore. So they predated these pop culture iterations by hundreds, if not thousands of years. So these silly notions that they were just created for TV in the past few decades are easily debunked, so to speak. All right, so the final point here, Roswell as myth. A June 1997 CNN Time poll revealed that the majority of people interviewed believed that aliens had indeed visited Earth and that aliens had landed at Roswell, but that all relevant information was being kept secret by the U.S. government. According to anthropologists Susan Harding and Kathleen Stewart, the Roswell story was a prime example of how a discourse moved from the fringes to the mainstream according to the prevailing zeitgeist. Public preoccupation in the 1980s with conspiracy cover-up and repression aligned well with the Roswell narratives as told in the sensational books which were being published. Additionally, skeptics and some social anthropologists saw the increasing elaborate accounts of alien crash landings and government cover-ups as evidence of a myth being constructed. Prominent skeptics Joe Nickell and co-author James McGaha identified a myth-making process which they called the Roswellian syndrome. In this syndrome, a myth is proposed to have 5 distinct stages of development: incident, debunking, submergence, mythologizing, and reemergence, and media bandwagon effect. The authors predicted that the Roswellian syndrome would play out again and again in other UFO and conspiracy stories. And again, ironically, it's the same point in terms of government propaganda and official narratives and coincidence theories. They kind of follow the same structure as well. All right. So, any final point here, Jr. In our introductory episode here? In the next episode, we'll be diving deep into the actual firsthand accounts and information that occurred at the time, debunking these so-called debunkers that are stating that all of these claims came many decades later.
Well, I would just ask that the viewership, keeps an open mind in general, because, it's proven that the government, just makes stuff up. It's also proven that people just make stuff up. So as we, delve deeper and deeper and deeper into this, I ask that, everyone forms their own opinion and, submit comments, because I really kind of want to answer, some of the questions that I know you're, gnawing at the bone for me to answer.
Well, that's what the next episode is for, JR. We'll be diving deep, so make sure you join us for the next episode. We'll be getting into more of the nitty-gritty revolving around the Roswell incident. Hope you guys enjoy another edition of the Mindshock podcast in the Roswell series. Feel free to leave any of your theories or beliefs regarding the Roswell crash, and if you know any individuals connected to the crash, we welcome second, third, fourth-hand accounts as well, because again, this is Mindshock, where the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure, so we will logically examine any theory or any account without falling for logical fallacies. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications, or you can just go to youtube.com/Mindshock. Like and share this particular podcast on social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You can also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. This is Bruce McGuire signing off.
Yeah, tapping it.
We'll catch you guys next time.